Welcome everyone. This is the second IRiS webinar for this academic year. And we run a seminar series which is on a monthly basis. And you can also look at them afterwards on IRiS website and blog and on IRiS, which stands for the Institute for Research into Superdiversity at the University of Birmingham YouTube page that I invite you to subscribe. It's a pleasure today to welcome Professor Vivien Lowndes from the University of Birmingham Institute of Local Government Studies, and Professors Rabia, Polat, Professor of Political Science at the Department of International Relations at İşık University in Turkey. And they will be presenting work on the multi-scale governance of Syrian refugees in the Turkish context, looking at the negotiation between different levels of governance and local practice of involving both vertically and horizontally a number of different actors. The presentation is going to be around half an hour, and then we'll leave space time for question. If you have any question, please just post them through the chat, and then I will be reading them to our presenters in the question and answer session. So I'll leave the floor to Professor Vivien Lowndes to present the research. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nando, for the introductions, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. We're grateful to IRiS and to Anne for organising the arrangements for the webinar and hosting us today. IRiS has been very supportive of our work from the beginning. Jenny Phillimore was a very helpful informal referee in helping us to produce our bid, which was successful, for the funding that underpins this research. So thank you to IRiS. So I'm just going to say a few remarks about the research project, and then I'll hand over to Rabia to deliver the paper. So the research that we're going to be talking about today is part of a British Academy Newton Advanced Fellowship Award. It was a 2-year award. It was supposed to finish at the end of August, but we've got a 1-year extension. So we're still doing the work, obviously limited in what field work and exchange visits we can do, but very keen to engage with anyone who's interested in our topic, and also happy to advise others thinking about applying for this award, which we found really fantastic basis for the research and also exchange between Birmingham, UK, İşık University in particular, and the Turkish Academy more generally. So our research is on local government responses to the Syrian refugee situation in Turkey, and it was motivated by the problematic of how it is that local authorities are coping with the needs of 3.5 million refugees who live in urban areas outside camps. And Rabia will tell you a lot more about that problematic and also how we think that circle has been squared, or is the attempts to make that happen. But the Newton Award also includes funds for training, and Rabia and some of her colleagues came to Birmingham last spring for training in for training in qualitative methods. We also had an exchange event around Turkish politics with colleagues from the Politics and International Studies Department here at Birmingham. And we were also able to fund some early career researchers from Turkey to attend some very prestigious online methods training. We've also got policy workshops still to run. They'll have to be online now. We've got one publication out in local government studies, and we're hoping that this paper will be the basis for another publication, and we'd very much welcome views on its strengths, its weaknesses, and perhaps where we might publish. So I'm going to hand over now to Rabia to present our paper. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Vivien, for this introduction. And thank you, Nando and IRiS, for giving us this opportunity. We have been working on this paper for some time now, And it's really nice to be able to share it with others, and we hope to get some useful feedback before we submit the paper for a journal submission. I just want to check if you are able to see my slides. Okay, great. So first I'm going to talk about the rationale behind this research. So why did we start at the first place? As Vivien said, this is a huge policy challenge for the Turkish government because the numbers are really big. We are talking about 3.6 million Syrian refugees, and 98% of them live outside of camps in urban settings. And this is a big challenge for local government, which lacks the necessary capacity and resources to address refugees' needs, because local government in Turkey is traditionally quite weak. So they don't have the authority to initiate policies, and they receive no extra funding to spend on refugees. We also need to consider the current context, the further centralization of power in Turkish politics since 2013, which also undermines local capacity for refugee integration because municipalities are under a lot of pressure by the central government. So we want to understand how traditionally weak local government is responding to the refugee situation in Turkey. And we specifically ask whether are multi-level governance arrangements helping municipalities generate capacity, and if so, what opportunities and tensions arise. I'd like to give some information about the policy context first. Then I will move on to the conceptual framework and the methodology. Then I will present research findings and finalize with some conclusions. In terms of the policy context, so it all started with what is called open door policy. That was the official policy of Turkey since the beginning of the crisis in 2011. And the national discourse was mostly based on hospitality, humanitarianism, and religious solidarity. And there was also a strong element of anti-Western narratives. I actually explored the national discourse in an article published in Critical Discourse Studies 2 years ago. So as a result of this open door policy, we have 2.5 million Syrian refugees in Turkey as of today. But this policy and discourse has been changing recently. For example, there is no new registration of refugees. There is this new narrative of voluntary return. Turkey is actually running a military campaign in Syria to establish some safe zones so that Syrians can go back. And actually, it is estimated that about 400,000 of them returned to Syria. In terms of the legal status, Turkey is actually a party to the 1951 Geneva Convention, but it applies a geographical limitation, and it doesn't accept refugees from its eastern borders. So when Syrians arrived to Turkey, at the beginning, they were initially seen as guests, which legally actually doesn't mean anything. But later, when it became clear that they were going to stay longer, there was a new regulation called Temporary Protection Law in 2014. So according to this one, they cannot be forced to return, and they also had access to education and health services. And also 2 years later, in 2016, there was another regulation for work permits for formal employment. Of course, before this, they were already working, but with this regulation, they started to be employed formally as well. This issue has also been a source of tension with the EU because Turkey accuses the EU for not sharing the burden in terms of the financial burden, but also in terms of not accepting enough number of refugees. The two sides signed a deal in March 2016 to prevent crossings through the Aegean Sea and to prevent loss of lives, which was a big crisis in 2015. This criticism of the EU has been featuring very frequently in the official discourse. I just want to show you this map so that you can visualize the situation a bit better. So this is the map of Turkey, and the colors indicate the number of Syrian refugees. And you see the bold red color in the border cities, which is not surprising. But you can also see that Syrians are also concentrated in big metropolitan areas, including Istanbul, which is our case study. And there are at least 500,000 Syrian refugees in Istanbul. By the way, we use the term refugee, but as I said before, legally Turkey does not recognize them as refugees. So the official title for Syrians in Turkey is Syrians under temporary protection. Before moving on, I'd like to introduce levels and actors of refugee policy, because the paper is about multi-level governance. So what are these levels? Of course, we start from the local level. That's our starting point. At the local level, we are talking about elected municipalities and neighborhood level muhtars. These people are also elected, but they are supposed to be non-partisan. At the national level, we are talking about the central government and its appointed agencies in certain provinces and districts. We are also talking about the Directorate of Migration Management, which was established in 2014 as a direct response to the Syrian crisis. There are also prefectures, which are like local branches of central government, so we don't consider them as local level. So they are appointed. So we are focusing on elected municipalities primarily. And at the international level, there may be other actors, but for our research, the most relevant ones are UNHCR, the European Union, and international donors. Among these actors, of course, among these levels, the national level is really important because, for example, it is the central government which determines foreign policy, which determines the legal status of Syrians, which confers citizenship to Syrians, which provides basic services such as education and health. But there are also certain services at the local level, and we explore them. So, as I said before, municipalities don't have the authority to initiate their own policies, and they don't receive extra funding to spend on refugees, but they developed some innovative forms of service delivery, particularly via partnerships with NGOs, and also by benefiting from international funding opportunities, also through NGOs. So what kind of services they provide? As I said before, Turkey is a highly centralized political system. So in general, municipalities don't have such power. But in relation to refugees, for example, they provide advice on how to access public services. They organize certain activities for promoting social cohesion. For example, Turkish language classes, vocational training, cash for work projects, catch-up classes for children. They provide certain personal services and also social and psychological support programs, such as hobby groups or drama classes for kids, etc. The extent and mix of services varies, reflecting different interpretations of refugees' needs and identities and their relationship with the host community. And actually, we explore them in more detail. We explore the local interpretations in our recent article published in Local Government Studies. So I just wanted to include some pictures demonstrating the activities that I've been talking about, especially targeting social cohesion and bringing together members of both communities. This was a picture that I took in Adana. We did some field work in Adana, but it's not included in this paper. So for example, this is a community center run by the Adana municipality, and they provide many of the services that I mentioned. And as you see, it's also funded by IOM, International Organization for Migration. Okay, in terms of the conceptual framework, we built on the local turn in migration studies, and this is a recent phenomenon in the literature. Academics are increasingly paying attention to what is going on in at the local level. So we build on that trend. But although our starting point is the local government, we also recognize the role of multi-level governance. We think that a multi-level governance approach enables us to analyze the negotiation of authority through vertical relationships between different levels of governance, as well as through horizontal interactions with NGOs. We are particularly influenced by this article by Caponio and Jones-Correa. They summarize it very well when they said nation states are increasingly shifting responsibilities for migration up towards international and supranational institutions, out towards non-public actors, and down towards local level authorities. So we want to see whether this is also the case in the Turkish context. Of course, MLG is a very contested concept as well. There's a lot of discussion about what it actually means, not only in migration studies literature, but in political science literature, in the European Union integration literature as well. So we also benefit from this article that I mentioned because they try to define the minimum conditions for an MLG situation. So accordingly, if we want to talk about an MLG situation, we need to be observing some kind of a challenge to vertical state-centered formal hierarchies. There has to be interdependence between actors operating at different levels, and there has to be bargaining and negotiation among different actors. So on top of this, we also wanted to continue what we did in our previous article, which was about local interpretations. We also want to see the role of political traditions, because all these developments are not happening within a vacuum. There are already existing governing traditions in Turkey as elsewhere. So how do they shape the MLG arrangements in refugee policy? So based on the policy context that I introduced and the conceptual framework, we identified these 3 research questions. And these questions will actually inform our data analysis and our research findings. So how has multi-level governance created capacity to meet refugees' needs? What opportunities and tensions have been created by the multi-level governance of refugee policy? And how do existing power relations and governing traditions influence MLG arrangements in refugee policy? In terms of data collection, research design, and methodology, let me provide some information. As I said, we focus on elected government, municipalities and muhtars within an MLG framework. Our case study is in Istanbul, at least for this paper. The broader project also includes fieldwork in Adana. And in Istanbul, we focus on 3 contrasting locations. We chose Istanbul because it hosts the largest number of Syrian refugees, at least 500,000. Also, it has a history of migration prior to the arrival of Syrians, and it is a microcosm of Turkey with its cosmopolitan and diverse character. In terms of data collection, our primary data source is semi-structured interviews. We interviewed 32 actors. These are mostly municipal actors, central agency representatives at the local level, local and international NGOs working with municipalities, and also international donors. So different actors at this multiple levels. The field research for Istanbul took place between November 2018 and September 2019. We coded our data manually based on the conceptual framework that I described, as well as themes arising from the fieldwork. So next, I will talk about the research findings, which I will summarize under 4 subheadings. So first, I will talk about the role of informality as an enabling factor. Then I will talk about the rise of non-state actors and the role of international actors, and also the role of bargaining, negotiation, and interdependence. So we have 1 slide for each of these, and then I will conclude with a summary. So although municipalities are in Turkey are known to be formally weak in a highly centralized political system, informally they have some capacity to develop their own policies. And we found that this is also the case when it comes to refugee policy. So informally, actually, they do a lot. And I chose this quote because I think it's very representative. So it says, this is an actor working at a union of or association of municipalities. She said, despite not having formal duties, municipalities have been doing a lot. They are the heroes of this process. The things they have done in relation to refugees, irrespective of the legal framework, are the best example of this. So the legal framework is different, but municipalities are doing something else. That's also the case for spending money. Formally, they don't have a specific budget to be spent on refugees, but they still spend money through non-cash aid or collaboration with NGOs. They try to find a way. So, and a municipal actor said, municipalities can do anything except for printing money. So he was trying to say, if there is will at the municipal level, you can actually do things for refugees. So we think that informality enables municipalities and NGOs to implicitly challenge the formal situation without taking too much risk. So informality can be seen as an enabling factor for these actors. But there is also a downside because in the absence of formal rights for refugees and formal responsibilities for municipalities, we have lots of ambiguities and inequalities in refugees' experiences. So their experience depends on where they live. In some municipalities, it's quite positive. In somewhere else, it may not be the case. We were also surprised by the emergence and rise of NGOs as important non-state actors, especially after 2015. We were surprised because this is in contrast to shrinking of civil society and also the democratic backlash in general in Turkey. So civil society in general is not in a very good situation at the moment, but the situation for NGOs working in this field, it is different. There's a very lively and vibrant NGO environment. And within an MLG framework, these NGOs exist along a horizontal dimension of governance, which is just as important as the vertical dimension. So what do they do in relation to refugees? They usually support municipalities in various ways, including service delivery, accessing international funds, because municipalities cannot do that on their own, transfer of expertise and know-how, support in human resources, help with norm diffusion, institutionalization of some practices, advocacy, etc. But again, their role is limited due to structural factors such as the strong state tradition in Turkey, which is we identify as a governing tradition, mistrust of civil society, and also clientelistic networks and existing polarization in the civil society environment. We also witnessed a lot of criticism towards these NGOs. NGOs themselves are raising these criticisms actually in terms of lack of expertise and experience. For example, one actor said NGOs emerged like mushrooms after 2015. So they don't really, some of them don't really have the expertise and experience. Dependence on international funding. So there are issues about sustainability. So when the international funds stop, what will happen to these NGOs? There are also issues around independence, because some of these NGOs are under government, let's say, control or influence. So they are more like GONGOs, government organized NGOs, rather than NGOs. About international actors, we found that they are really important in terms of norm diffusion. What kind of norms we are talking about here? For example, the principle of non-refoulement, right-based discourses. So international actors are disseminating this kind of narratives. They also, of course, they also transfer funds and know-how. And know-how is really important as well, because Turkey doesn't have this expertise and experience in hosting such big numbers of refugees. UNHCR, for example, is an important actor in terms of help building technical capacity, mobilizing international funding. They, for example, as a specific project, they are funding a project to establish social protection desks in 12 municipalities, and it is hoped that in the future this will become permanent migration units in these municipalities. They also promote refugee councils to give more voice to refugees. International funding shapes policy a lot because it enables local actors to be more flexible, to develop projects more quickly, and to avoid criticism from their local constituency. Because when they spend money for refugees, it's not exactly a vote-winning thing for them. And they have to compete in the elections. And there are public opinion polls in Turkey are turning against refugees recently. So this international funding is really important. But of course, international funding comes with certain conditions in terms of target audience, aims, measurement methods. An NGO actor, for example, he wasn't very happy about this, and he said, who gives the money gives the orders. There are also challenges around securing financial accountability and avoiding nepotism, which is important for international donors. But this doesn't mean that everything is so top-down. There are also bottom-up influences. NGOs are not simply the implementers of externally planned and funded projects. They have some capacity in shaping projects, and that's also the case for municipalities. So finally, we also identified a lot of bargaining, negotiation, and interdependence between these levels. For example, international actors depend on Turkey for controlling its borders, especially the European side, protecting refugee rights, and using international funds effectively. Turkey depends on international actors for sharing the financial burden, providing political technical support. For example, in the initial years, the Turkish state was not even capable of registering Syrians because the numbers were so huge. So UNHCR was helping in registering Syrians. Municipalities depend on NGOs for service delivery, technical expertise, and financial resources. NGOs depend on municipalities for reaching out to refugee and host communities. And they are aware that they cannot operate in this field without the consent and cooperation of the state. For example, an NGO working in child protection told us it is very important to work together with the state. If you need to take the child from the family, for example, you cannot do this without the state. So there is constant bargaining between these levels, and there is a lot of negotiation and interdependence. So in order to summarize, we found that informality enables municipalities to bypass the formal situation, and it creates spaces for maneuver. But the lack of formal and institutionalized mechanisms also leads to unequal outcomes for refugees. We found that NGOs have an increasing role in this field, despite the more general shrinking of civil society in Turkey. We found that international actors, particularly funders, influence policy through funding mechanisms and norm diffusion. And we found patterns of negotiation, bargaining, and interdependence between all these actors. However, MLG, the existence of all these actors and all this interdependence between them, it doesn't imply the weakening of the state, nor the empowerment of local actors. We don't suggest that. Rather, it denotes increased complexity, including the layering of horizontal networks of interaction on top of hierarchy. So we don't suggest that the Turkish state is becoming weaker as a result of these MLG arrangements. So going back to our research questions, and this is my last slide, so we need to revisit the research questions. So we think that we found that multi-level governance actually creates capacity to meet refugees' needs, and this is really important because resources are so scarce and the challenge is so big. So here we are talking about international funding and partnership with NGOs especially. We also found that multi-level governance of refugee policy created some tensions as well. For example, mutual accusations between the EU and Turkey, the pressure on NGOs by the Turkish government, or bypassing the national government by municipalities. You have all these tensions between these actors. We also found that existing power relations and governing traditions influence the MLG arrangements in the refugee policy. And here we are talking about the strong state tradition, mistrust of civil society, clientelism and nepotism. So they are still strong, but they are also challenged. For example, the requests for financial accountability by international donors is a challenge to nepotism, for example. And finally, we are aware of the limitations of our research, and we suggest that further research could compare Istanbul findings with other Turkish cities or test our findings in other countries hosting such large number of Syrian refugees. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.
I was on time. Great.
Yeah, perfect timing, and thank you very much. Vivien, do you want to add anything before we move to the question?
No, I don't have anything to add. Just happy to help Rabia with the responses and look forward to hearing people's reactions.
Okay. So can you please, for our participant, if you can post your question in the chat, then I will read them. Maybe before starting, I have a point around the politics of the multi-level governance that I would like to ask you about. there are some sort of decisions that are located at a specific level. I mean, I know that, for example, there has been a lot of debate around the issues of giving citizenship to Syrians in Turkey, and what does that mean, for example, or allowing people to access public health, hospitals, and not paying for the support. So I was wondering, while all the living together is it located in the city, is a local relation, the local encounters that on those spaces at local level, you have the different kind of legal and policy sort of actors operating. So I was wondering how the local authorities manage the decision taken at other level and the tension that produced locally around access to welfare system, for example.
Well, I think in our other paper that's just come out in Local Government Studies, we look at how different districts within Istanbul as a single city actually handled those tensions in quite different ways, with some actually setting up parallel services through developing, sponsoring NGOs, so-called, and securing international funding. So they actually had a kind of parallel process, whereas other districts were very much seeking to treat the Syrian refugees very much as another disadvantaged group and to secure access to them almost through for them to services and help through classing them in that way. But I don't know whether Rabia wants to add anything.
Yes, about citizenship, so far 120,000 Syrians have been conferred citizenship, and this is a very controversial issue. It was introduced as an idea 4 years ago by President Erdogan, and it created a lot of tension in society, even among his party members. So the government stepped back from that suggestion. So far the numbers are about 120,000, and that's usually based on skills and capital. So it's not equally distributed among Syrian refugees. And when you think about millions of them, the number is quite small. But as I said, it's a very controversial issue. There's a lot of opposition to giving citizenship to Syrians. So at the moment, it's going very slowly. And local authorities, municipalities, they don't have any control, any say on this. This is completely national government business.
Thank you. I have a question from Jenny Phillimore around what are the mechanisms for distribution of EU funding for refugee actors, and to what extent they contribute also to the shape that the NGO sector takes, so the mushroomings of NGOs.
Yeah. Some of this EU funding is distributed through certain programs. For example, there is one to support education. So families with children are given certain amount of monthly allowances to promote them to send their kids to school. So that is administered by the central government. There is also another cash support program. So families are given a card. So with that card, they withdraw some amount of cash that they can spend. Municipalities, they don't have access to this funding directly. So they have to cooperate with NGOs. So as far as we understand, what happens is international donors, for example, they give money to big NGOs, international NGOs. Then these international NGOs find a local partner, and then the local partner cooperates with a municipality, and they build, for example, a community center, and they spend the money to provide services to refugees in that community center. So there is a lot of partnership going on between international NGOs, Turkish NGOs, and municipalities. I used the word mushrooming deliberately. That was also a word used by one of the persons that we interviewed. That was also a criticism because it is suggested that some of these NGOs just follow the money because the international funding is available. It's an opportunity for some NGOs. Of course, NGOs provide lots of services and they really feel a gap. So we have to say that. But there is also this kind of criticisms against NGOs.
Okay, thank you very much. I got two more questions. One is from Laura Pontin and is around if you identify variations at local level. I mean, in your case studies in terms of how the multi-level governance operates and the impact that has the different approaches. And the other question is from Wen Yu Wu and looks at the role of asking about the faith-based organizations and their relationship with municipalities and other NGOs in the refugee support sector.
Okay. Let me start with the last one, faith-based organizations. They were very important, especially at the beginning, because the whole national discourse was also very much based on religious solidarity. So that kind of discourse was important in mobilizing support for hosting refugees. And before we started the fieldwork, we were expecting some kind of polarization along, secularism, for example, which is an important issue in Turkish politics. So we were expecting that there might be divisions between faith-based NGOs, more secular NGOs, etc. But we found that on this issue, there is a lot of cooperation and not much polarization. At least NGOs themselves, they don't feel that polarization. But municipal actors, when they need to cooperate with an NGO, sometimes they are selective and they want to cooperate with an NGO which is politically closer to them. So it plays some role. Faith-based organizations were more important at the beginning of the crisis, but I think it is still important because religion and secularism is an important issue in Turkish politics.
Thank you very much.
And Nando, shall I have a go at the one about differences between districts, but also what we meant by capacity?
Yeah.
Thanks for the questions. When we're talking about the capacity of strengthening the capacity of municipalities, we're not so much meaning in a general sense, but in terms of their capacity to respond to the needs of refugees, given these are organisations that have no dedicated budgets to serve refugees, and indeed some legal ambiguity about whether they can use their own funds to support people who aren't citizens. So it's a kind of puzzle about how is it, however imperfectely, that refugee services and facilities have been developed locally. So we undertook fieldwork in 3 districts of Istanbul, and apologies for my pronunciation, Sultanbeyli, Şişli and Zeytinburnu. And yes, we found quite different responses. So there was a common theme around the generation of local capacity in quite innovative ways, but there were quite different understandings of the challenge and kind of policy discourse underpinning how it was that municipalities reacted. So in one of those districts, which was opposition controlled, there was a very strong equal rights discourse around treating Syrians as, in effect, refugees with human rights. And provision of services was very much to Syrians as another group of migrants. In Sultanbeyli, which was AKP controlled, despite that, they were absolutely expert at leveraging funding from the EU, for instance, despite the AKP's hostile national discourse towards EU refugee policy. And they had the most elaborate facilities and services. And one of our respondents actually referred to the community centre as the Syrian municipality. So the idea of a municipality within the municipality. So that was the way that happened in Sultan Beyli. I've talked about Shishli, and in Zeytinburnu we saw a very pragmatic response in which the Syrians were very much reached out to as people suffering disadvantage, whether that was the needs of women, of children, elderly or disabled people. In terms of whether this expanded capacity benefited non-refugees, it was noticeable during the development over time of services and facilities that they were increasingly opened where they had begun, when they had been initiated as Syrian only, they were increasingly opened to include local Turkish citizens, and that was very much in tune with the EU prioritisation of social cohesion, but also the central government's discourse of harmonisation, so a discourse, but leaving the municipalities very much to work out their own way of making that happen.
Thank you very much. We have two more questions. One is from Feride Kumbassar asking about the registration of the refugees that live outside camps and how this is affecting their access. You know, are they registered, and does the registration make a difference in terms of services access?
Yeah, I also noticed another question at the top. I want to address that one as well, about our use of the word safe zone.
Yeah.
So we were talking about the government's wording here. Of course, the government has two purposes in conducting that military campaign. One of them is to create safe zones so that Syrians can go back, but also to contain the Kurdish forces and to prevent the emergence of a Kurdish entity in northern Syria. So just wanted to address that point, but that was beyond our field work anyway. About Feride's question, so refugees are asked to stay in wherever they are registered. They can only access services if they stay in where they are registered. And here I'm talking about education and health services. But this is very difficult for them because they want to find jobs which is not equally distributed. So they want to move on to metropolitan cities. And in the last 2 years or so, the government has been tightening control. So there are more regular checks, random checks, for example, in Istanbul, to find refugees who are not registered and to send them back to wherever they are registered. So it was more flexible, but it's becoming more rigid, more strict at the moment. So they are supposed to stay where they are registered.
Got a question from Natasha Nichols around the implementation of the service delivery and the relationship between local authorities and NGOs in delivering services. How does it work in terms of the funding? So does the funding go directly to the NGOs or to the municipality, and then the municipality distribute?
Well, it has to be NGOs. So municipalities cannot do that directly, but what they can do is, for example, in Sultan Beyli that Vivien was talking about, the municipality established an NGO, which is like an kind of an oxymoron. It is more like an Congo, but it was also a pragmatic response because the municipality was not able to access international funds. So this was a solution. So with this NGO, the municipality was able to access these funds. So they used the money to build 2 giant community centers And in these community centers, they provide lots of services such as Turkish classes, catch-up classes for Syrian students, vocational training, legal counseling and advice. So these are the sort of services that we've been talking about. But the money is usually in the, not usually, always in the NGO. In the case of Zeytinburnu, for example, what happened is the municipality already had a building, a community center, but with money coming from NGO, they built an extra floor so that they can serve more refugees. So these are just some examples of how the money is spent and how services are provided jointly by NGOs and municipalities.
Thank you very much. I have another question around the role of the extent to which refugees prefer to engage with faith-based Islamic NGOs versus secular NGOs.
I cannot answer this because we didn't interview refugees. We didn't, it's beyond the scope of our research. So our research was about local responses. Mm-hmm. So that includes municipalities and NGOs. So I can only speculate. And I guess it would be, there wouldn't be a monolithic approach. So it depends on their ideas about secularism, religiosity, etc. So just as the Turkish society is very divided, I expect Syrian refugees to have different opinions on this.
Sure. Thank you very much, Rabia. I have a question around obviously the Syrians are not refugees according to international law, but they are under sort of temporary protection. I was wondering, in their relationship with the municipality, and obviously this situation is become a situation of protracted refugee situation. People are lost. It's the temporariness that is expanding. I was wondering to what extent the municipality cater for the long term, the medium terms, or the kind of services that are available are much more for the emergency, the short term. So is there a circulation of the population of the people that use their services, or is more or less people stays in the place, and so is building up, crystallizing as a services?
Yeah. Okay, I think the nature of services have been changing. So at the beginning, it was more about meeting emergent needs, basic needs. But now it is moving towards social cohesion. And I think that's also the language used by European Union as well, because EU also has an interest in promoting social cohesion in Turkey so that Syrians would have, stable lives in Turkey and they wouldn't move on to Europe. So the language is now towards social. The Turkish government uses the word harmonization, by the way, never says integration. I think that's too strong maybe for the government. Harmonization is used. So when we look at the services by municipalities, for example, more and more they provide language classes because it has become obvious that they are going to stay. So they need to speak the language, whereas that wasn't the case at the beginning. At the beginning, it was more about, distributing food parcels or providing some emergent health services or providing accommodation, that kind of stuff. But now services are moving towards more social cohesion, acknowledging the fact that most of Syrians will stay in Turkey.
I think another example would be thinking about education, where there's been a shift from providing specific education in Arabic for Syrian refugee children towards supporting Syrian children within Turkish schools, whether that's supporting children to catch up or with Turkish language, or encouraging families and parents to feel more comfortable in the school. We did also find that in at least one of our the districts where we researched, that there was more of an emphasis upon signposting Syrian families to mainstream services than there was upon delivering bespoke services. So a more kind of rights-based facility, you know, what is it that you can access? How do you access it? What support do you need to do so? So there was both change over time, but also different strategies in different districts within the city of Istanbul, which appeared to relate to the history, culture, traditions of each district, as well as the activities of some very important and catalytic actors, mayors, and so on.
We got just a final question, if you can answer briefly, is around what about the relationship between municipality and the non-Syrian refugees? Are they basically in the same picture, or are they treated completely differently in the relationship with the municipalities?
Okay, this project is about Syrian refugees only, but I can still answer this question. Well, this temporary protection law is only for Syrians. So non-Syrian refugees, again, they are not recognized as refugees legally because they come from Turkey's eastern borders, and they are not covered by this temporary protection law. So actually, Syrians are, I don't want to use the word privileged, but they have, compared to Afghans, Iraqis, and Iranians, they are in a, let's say, better position. Afghans, Iraqis, and Iranians, they are completely on their own. So they work in the informal market and without any access to public services.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think, I mean, Vivien, do you want to add anything?
No. Thank you very much
I had the impression you were sort of getting a breath. Thank you very much for your presentation and for this discussion. I think it's a very, obviously a very important topic, and there are so many sort of ramifications on the relationship between this different level of governance and the politics that in the tensions you talk about is for sure something we're going to see develop over the next few years as well. It's not something that's going to solve very quickly this temporary crisis situation we are experiencing. So thank you very much, and look forward to see everyone to the next IRiS webinar at the end of the month. We're going to circulate information as soon as it will be available. Thank you very much.